All right, guys, it's going to be a brief overview of World War II, kind of why the United States enters the war, what goes on during the war, and then a couple things that happen after the war for us. But first, I want to start out the PowerPoint with maybe one of the most famous pictures from World War II right here. This is the landing at Normandy during D-Day. This is when the United States, Britain, and Canada will try to retake France from Germany. If you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan with Tom Hanks, they do a really good job in the first 20 minutes of that movie depicting of what this landing would look like. And I got to understand, this landing isn't something that was planned in a week and they're like, okay, let's go do this. This day, this D-Day, it took over 2 years to plan, where they had to build up all the resources, put all those resources in England, and then finally on June 6th, they decided to actually invade. The weather was proper. Weather was good for them to actually go invade France, and they moved everything across the English Channel very quickly. Okay. But first, we want to look at some neutrality acts that occurred in the 1930s. If you remember, after World War I, we had this term called return to normalcy by Warren G. Harding, where we're going back to being isolated. And throughout the 1920s, we were isolated. We kind of stayed to ourselves. We didn't get involved in a lot of foreign affairs. And when there are some world issues popping up in the 1930s, the United States will pass two different neutrality acts that will basically say we're not going to get involved in foreign affairs. One of them will specifically say we're not going to sell goods to warring countries, because before World War I, we were selling goods to warring countries and our boats were being sunk in the Atlantic by Germany, and we're losing American lives, and that will be one reason we get dragged into the war. So to try to prevent that from happening again, we're going to say, hey, we're not going to sell goods to warring countries. However, as tensions keep increasing throughout the world and our allies need assistance, specifically England and Europe, we're going to change that Neutrality Act towards the 1937 and then also the 1940s to cash and carry, which says that if a country paid us in cash up front, we'll give them what they need. And then we'll go be even more lenient with the Lend-Lease Acts in the 1940s, where we're basically going to give our allies and whatever they needed through any means necessary, and we worry about payment in the future. So again, in the 1930s, we try to stay neutral again. We try to stay out of the war. When World War II starts in 1939 in Europe, just like World War I, the United States is not in World War II in the beginning. We are staying out of it. The biggest question, what drags us into the war, and probably one of the most famous events in U.S. history, most people have heard about this, is going to be Pearl Harbor. Before the war, the United States is not selling Japan oil and steel, and this is why Japan will be mad at the United States. Japan will invade an area in China called Manchuria. We will tell them that basically that is not acceptable, and that if they stay there, we're going to place an embargo on them where we won't trade certain things with them. And they did stay, and then we will stop selling the oil and steel, which will make them a little mad at us. Japan's trying to take over all the Pacific. The biggest threat to the Pacific's obviously the United States, because we have several naval bases, none bigger than Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. On December 7th, 1941, Japan will bomb Pearl Harbor because we will have pretty much our whole Pacific fleet in Pearl Harbor with our battleships lined up in a perfect row to be attacked. FDR, when he gives his speech to Congress, he calls it a day that will live in infamy, or, a day that we will never forget, which is true. Most people know if you say December 7th, 1941, most Americans will be able to tell you what happened that day. It takes us probably 24 hours to enter World War II after this attack. When they voted in Congress to go to war, it was a 434-1 vote, probably one of the only times in U.S. history where all Republicans and Democrats agreed on anything. The one person that voted against going to war was actually a pacifist, so they wanted to stay out of it because they're pacifists or against any type of violence. One thing that did work in our favor in this attack is that Japan was unable to destroy our aircraft carriers and oil containers. Our aircraft carriers in the days leading up to Pearl Harbor had gone out to sea, and the destroyers and other ships were on their way to go visit them, or not visit them, but to go get out there and be with them. And so they didn't get our aircraft carriers, which are big because these are, multi-million, multi-billion-dollar boats. And also our oil containers and oil fields remain intact, so we're able to still refuel ships from Pearl Harbor. If they destroy these two things, instead of fighting World War II in the Pacific from Hawaii, we would have been fighting from, San Francisco on the West Coast, which would have delayed our Pacific War and World War II by a couple years. Right? Some things that happened during the war. One of the big things is rationing. This occurs during war to conserve resources. You're seeing that in some stores right now due to the coronavirus outbreak. We can only buy a certain amount of goods, specifically meat. Okay? This is controlled by the War Production Board back then. You had to have certain points to get certain materials. If you didn't have those points, you're unable to buy things like bread and milk. To help feed the military even more, people will start growing what's called victory gardens. These victory gardens are just gardens grown in people's backyard, tomatoes, onions, potatoes, peppers, whatever they could grow, and they would use it for themselves, but also they would donate that to the U.S. government to help feed troops. This war is an all-in effort. You didn't go anywhere every day and during World War II and not know something that was going on about World War II because it was such a big part of our country. Next, we're going to have a symbol called Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter is a symbol for women working in factories during World War II. It's also a really famous song. You can actually look it up on YouTube. In our modern ideas, we call it kind of corny, but it is a song as well. And, you're going to have millions of men fighting during World War II, serving the military. And because of that, you're going to need, a workforce, a labor force to make all this goods. And so women will step up again, just like they did in World War I, just on a larger scale during World War II. And this symbol, again, is called Rosie the Riveter. Without women working in the factories during World War II, the United States would be unable to produce what's needed to help us win the war. So women are going to be a big part during World War II to help America win and defeat Germany and also Japan. You see, here's a famous picture of women working in factories. They take up all jobs, not just machine jobs, but they're going to be making planes, tanks, guns, bullets, everything you can imagine. Women will be doing. Here's another. I get a couple pictures here of some mass production we're going to use during the war. You see women working here. This is the front of a bomber plane during World War II. These would be the planes that would fly over cities and drop bombs. The navigator would actually sit in front on this, this glass nose of the plane. They'd be looking straight down to see where the target is. And they would have their finger on a bomb bay door, which opened the door, and there'd be another button that would release bombs as they were flying. Here's some more. Here's that bomber we talked about. And just see how much we're actually making. Then you see the artillery shells coming out. We're measuring, make sure they fit specification. There's that glass part again, just kind of off topic. That glass part you saw on the previous slide. And then here's one of the most famous vehicles ever produced during a war. It's called the Jeep. Every 3 minutes, we're producing 4 of these in the country. Ford and other automobile manufacturers aren't making cars during the war because there's the steel and the rubber is being rationed for the military. So you're not going to be able to buy, say, a Model T during the war because Ford is using all those materials to build Jeeps. The Jeep could be flown in behind enemy lines. It could hold up to 7 people. And it was light enough where you could literally just flip it over if it got stuck. It's a 4-wheel drive vehicle that was very versatile. Okay. Another very famous thing that happened during World War II, and you can't really talk about it without mentioning this, is going to be the Holocaust. It's going to be Hitler's final solution. Hitler's going to blame the Jewish race for the war, going to blame the Jewish race for the problems of Germany. Germany, after World War I, will go into an extreme depression, and which gives Hitler an opportunity to come to power because he'll start promising things to the people and he'll follow through. Specifically, hey, I'm going to get you jobs back. He does it. I'll get you your homes back. He does it. And then he's going to start blaming the Jewish race for their problems, and the Germany will start believing him because he's followed through on several other things. So he's been the Jewish people are the reason for our problems. We need to make them suffer and get rid of them. And at first, they're going to put them in ghettos. These are areas inside of cities that are fenced in where only Jewish people are allowed to be. And then those ghettos will not be enough. Warsaw Ghetto is a very famous one in Poland. He's eventually going to move into concentration camps where instead of just having them stay in one area, he's going to make them work. And if they weren't of age to work, he'll end up killing them because they're not needed. Approximately 6 million Jewish people are killed. These numbers are very averaged. We're not really sure. It could be a lot more. It could be a little less. But that's the number that is generally accepted among the history community. And the reason this is not known is because you really don't know how many people were killed, because they're not taking count as they're killing. The most famous concentration camp was Auschwitz. We'll go over some pictures quick. To the right, you're going to see a barracks inside of concentration camps where Jewish people would stay, very tight, cramped spaces. Here's a famous picture of the rings, wedding rings and bands that Jewish people had to give up as they entered the camp. They would then melt these silver or gold rings down to create, gold bars to help pay for the war. Just gives you an idea how many people going into these camps. Here's a picture when we liberate one of the camps. You can see the bodies of the Jewish people. When you can see ribs and stuff like that, it's called emaciated because they're malnourished, not being treated very well. Here's a picture, if you ever seen the movie Boy in the Striped Pajamas. There were children in these camps as well. If you want to have a good cry, watch this movie. This is a funeral after we liberate a concentration camp, showing you all the bodies coming out in these coffins. They're actually able to have a real funeral. Before that, it was just pretty much a mass graves. And then here's a picture of Auschwitz with the gas chambers, where if you're a Jewish person going in, you might get a shower where you would get clean, or you might get what's called a gas shower, and you could be exterminated at that point. A layout of Auschwitz, you can see the crematoriums, these gas chambers that were built. There's several of them. The idea of how large it was. This is the expansion they were working on. They're trying to double the size of it towards the end of the war. A couple of things for the end of the war. What actually ends World War II is going to be the dropping of the atomic bombs by the United States in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You see the devastation of this weapon. We have weapons that are nuclear weapons that are 50 to 100 times more powerful than this. And that's why the idea of nuclear war is very scary, because, if you dropped a bomb like that on a major city center, you could kill, 5, 10, 15 million people within a minute. But we dropped this bomb on August 6th, the first one on Hiroshima. We wait for a response, and the second one gets dropped a few days later on Nagasaki, and then immediately Japan will surrender, because, if we go day by day and keep dropping these bombs, you could literally wipe out all these cities. People ask, why don't we drop it on Tokyo? We didn't want to kill as many people as possible. We want to send a message. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki were major centers of production for Japan for the war when it comes to war materials. So they drop them on those cities instead of Tokyo, which is a city of several million people. Here's a picture of what the atomic bomb looked like back then. After World War II, the Cold War will start. It's not an actual war, but it's a military buildup between us and the Soviet Union. And that's going to last from 1940s all the way until 1990. Even some people today will argue it's still going on today. And another thing that comes out of World War II is going to be the debate on the morality of using atomic weapons. Should these weapons be used? If so, when? What justifies us dropping a nuclear weapon on another country? Obviously, no other country has used a nuclear weapon on a civilian or military population since World War II. Now, these weapons have been tested several times, but not actually used. And another famous thing that comes out of the war, it's called the Nuremberg Trials. These trials were set up after the war to hold individuals accountable for their military actions. Leaders that were responsible for crimes against humanity, meaning that leaders who authorized the Holocaust and atrocities by Japan and China will be held accountable. Hideki Tojo, who was one of the highest military leaders in the Japanese military, will go to a Nuremberg trial and be found guilty, and he will actually be put to death at a Nuremberg trial. If Adolf Hitler didn't commit suicide and kill himself at the end of World War II, he would have been held responsible. Nuremberg trials didn't just take place in Nuremberg. They took place throughout the world, and they're still going on today. Now, we don't see it as much anymore, but if you go back 10 years, every year, every 2 years, you would find a German person or Japanese person who was responsible for war atrocities during World War II, who was hiding out in the world. They would be found and caught, and then they would go through a war trial. There's one famous one about 5 years ago. A guy was living in Ohio, and they found out that he was in a concentration camp and was responsible for stuff that happened, and he was put through a Nuremberg trial, and then he was sent to jail for the rest of his life. Okay, guys, that'll be the end. Hope you're still having a good one. Stay safe, and we will see you later.